history nerds and historians. My name is Christina, and this is Effed Up Witch History. This story talk a little bit from history about the witch trials specifically. That's super fucked up. So, before we get into that, update for anyone who cares. I will not say where because people on the internet can be really weird, but your girl got a job as an education manager at a historic organization. So I am officially living my dream life. I am like stoked about it. When I'm recording this, I got offered the job yesterday, and I'm freaking out, and I'm so excited because I just love educating people about history, and I'm so passionate about it. And the whole reason that I started this podcast was to make learning about history fun and enjoyable and conversational for adults, and challenge the notions that history has to be this like really uptight, stuffy thing. Like, teaching about history doesn't have to be the teacher from Ferris Bueller, which is what most people think. I have wanted to be a education manager, a historical education manager or director or whatever the title is, like, since I discovered that that was a job, and I'm fucking doing it, and it is bananas to me, and I got a lot of feelings about it. Like, I interviewed for this job, and the process of that was actually like really enjoyable and really, I don't know, it gave me a lot of hope for the history field, like the specific things that this historical institution is doing. I have interviewed for jobs before that I was like, oh yeah, like this is my dream job. Like, this is so cool. This is like an ideal job, because I didn't think that this job existed. And I thought that I had to kind of work my way up in the history field to make this job for myself as like a consultant or something. And it exists. And I as I was going through this whole like actually really enjoyable process of interviewing for this position, there were these two like historic sites that I love, that I visit all the time. Like, when people come and visit me, not to just go on tours, but like when people like come to see me, I bring them to these places. And through people that I know and connections that I have made since being up here, I now have these two opportunities to talk about my research. I'm going to be giving a talk on apotropaic symbols in England and New England in a fucking castle for an hour. I'm going to be talking about the Witch's Familiar and all of the research that I've done on that at one of the oldest historic cemeteries in the country, or at least partially sponsored by one of the oldest historic cemeteries in the country. And it all happened so quickly and in such quick succession, and everything fell into place at once, and I am just like overwhelmed with life and all of these opportunities. And I had a moment yesterday where I was just like, man, I love being alive. Like, everything that I've done and all like the hardship and the heartbreak that I've faced, like, it's not okay, obviously, but like it got me to this place. Like, it led me to breaking down in a Buffalo Wild Wings last night over my BOGO wings, because I said it out loud to my husband that, like, I'm so happy to be alive. I'm almost 32 years old, and I don't think I've ever thought that. And like, I don't know. I'm still incredibly mentally ill, obviously. But I'm just like, I'm really proud of myself, and I just wanted to share it with you all. Because you all have been a really big part of it too. And there are some of you who have met in person, and there are some of you who have like reached out to me that are so wonderful. And I know for every wonderful person that I've met or that's reached out to me, there's, I don't know, maybe 5 people who haven't and will never reach out to me because you're antisocial like me. And I don't know, like I said I wasn't gonna cry when I was like logging on to record this and getting everything set up. I'm like, I'm gonna tell them and I'm not gonna cry because I've done enough of that in my life. But it really does get better. I'm gonna take a break for a moment, and then we're gonna move on to talk about this episode about a really weird case of English witchcraft. Hey, so I know it's like instant for you guys, but it's like a week later for me. I just was in a lot of my feelings and didn't want to continue recording that day. So it's actually like a week later. I'm actually about to leave for that job that I was to you just talking about in about an hour. And I'm a little nervous about it. So I'm going to kind of take my mind off of it by continuing to tell you all about John Walsh. So, as I have said about 1,000,007 times on this podcast, but I will say again for anyone who might be new, hi, my name is Christina. I'm a historian of the early modern witch trials. That means that this is my historical specialty. That means this is what I have done the most amount of personal academic research on. This is what I have presented at conferences about. I am in the process of trying to get published for. This is the subject that I will be having speaking arrangements about this year. I would consider myself a subject matter expert in the history of witchcraft, especially the trials that were occurring in England and the American colonies. Now, does this mean that I know everything? No. Does this mean that I know more than 90% of the population? Probably. I have just finished my master's degree, which means I don't have to do research for a grade anymore. And my job that I have now doesn't really have anything to do with the subject. Like, it might come up because it's kind of local and I might be able to do some stuff with it. But like my day-to-day assignment as of right now doesn't really have much to do with the history of witchcraft, which is honestly awesome because I love learning about other things. I have not decided if I'm going to go for a PhD yet, but as of right now, I'm more just like dreading when the government starts to ask me about when I'm going to pay my student loans and less worried about tacking on even more student loans to that. But I do miss researching sort of specific cases of witchcraft. And if I do decide to go on to my PhD, knowing all of these cases would be nothing but a benefit. And believe me when I say there are a lot of witchcraft cases between England and the British American colonies. According to Charlotte Rose Miller, who is a historian that has written quite a bit about my niche subject matter in this field, said that she counted 66 witchcraft pamphlets in England alone, which has like 1% of the overall cases in Western Europe. But this was at her discretion. It doesn't include general treatises about witchcraft or demonologies or pamphlets that talk about witchcraft in conjunction with other topics, which I'll want to read all of those as well. And that doesn't even start to talk about all of the cases here in the British American colonies, in Massachusetts alone. Honestly, Lindsay, who was on one of my previous episodes, she is in Western Massachusetts, and she's just like constantly being like, oh, hey, look at this random thing I came across about witches and witch trials that happened over there. So I want to keep learning more and keep talking about more, and that's what I'm planning on doing. I am planning on going through more witch history. So hopefully y'all like that. This isn't going to transition this podcast to just be like a witch history podcast, but it's going to go into the rotation. So it'll be like non-witchy history, mythology sometimes, witch history, and maybe like a little bit of historical true crime. Although I typically argue that I consider witch trial cases true crime. Like, they typically include murder or some other accusation of a crime committed, a court case, often end in an execution or a prison sentence, which to me is all true crime. Why some people kind of put them separately doesn't really fully make sense to me. So today we're going to talk about another one of those really early cases. It's actually the second witchcraft pamphlet in England. So I did the first witchcraft case in March of 2022 about Agnes Waterhouse. I might try to go in chronological order through these English pamphlets. I haven't fully decided yet. We'll see. But for this one, we're going to be talking about the witch trial of John Walsh from August of 1566. And it's interesting because it's a witch trial case, but also like not a witch trial case. I know that's very confusing, but I'm going to explain it as we go. It's also one of the only pamphlets in England that I can think of right now that focuses like solely on a male witch, which is rare in most places. There are often men who were accused and executed for witchcraft, but to have one be like the main subject of a pamphlet is kind of rare and interesting to find. So without further ado, sit back, relax, and practice your oh good god, what the fuck faces. So before we talk about Mr. Walsh, let's sort of set the scene. So if you've listened to some of my episodes in the past of the Effed Up Witch History or Effed Up Witch-ory, you may have heard some of this before. I have too. I've said it so many times. It just like naturally comes to me and I can kind of just like spout it off the cuff. But I really want to like set the scene and not just dive right into this because there's a lot of stuff going on sort of behind the scenes that factor into this. So by 1566, witch trial cases in England weren't necessarily new, but the way that they were conducted were new. So in 1542, King Henry VIII, which just love him, implemented the first Witchcraft Act, which changed the way that witch trials would be conducted in England. So before this, if someone was accused of witchcraft, it would be handled by the church. And if the person were to be found guilty, they were guilty of heresy and would be burned at the stake, which was the sentence for heresy because you weren't supposed to like spill the blood of the heretic. So for example, there's woman named Marjorie Jordan who was accused of witchcraft and false belief and was burned at the stake in London in 1441. There were others, of course, but that's one of like the most popular cases that you'll read about mid 1500s, especially if you're just sort of like Googling it or trying to learn more about it. When the Witchcraft Act passed in 1542, it criminalized witchcraft. So it would no longer be handled by the church. It would be handled in court. So the terminology of this act said that maleficium, or magic done to do harm to a person or their belongings, as well as love spells and using magic to find treasure or other lost goods, would result in the person suffering pain of death. They would then forfeit all of their lands and be excommunicated from the church. This was repealed pretty quickly when Henry's son, Edward VI, took the throne in 1547. And as far as I've been able to find in looking through primary and secondary sources, no one was executed under the 1542 Act. There's honestly been very little research done about this time period as it relates to witchcraft at all. Like, I have no idea when this act was even passed. But I'd certainly like to, honestly. Then there's like all this drama in England. I did talk about a bit of this when I talked about Edward VI and Lady Jane Grey, but it continues on with Mary I and all that happened to her and like burning people at the stake and for actual heresy in her opinion. I want to say I will do an episode on her at some point. I have like a third of a script written, but it's so much for her that I get overwhelmed and just don't want to work on it. So eventually it'll come out, but like, please don't hold your breath for it. In 1558, Elizabeth I became queen, and there was talk about this Catholic plot against her and the Catholics who were resorting to dark magic to kill her and put a Catholic back on the throne. So as early as 1559, there were proposals for a Witchcraft Act under Elizabeth. And in 1563, it was finally passed. It recycled a lot of the language of that 1542 Act, but implemented harsher and more defined punishments. So if someone was to use magic to kill someone, it would be immediate execution and they would be excommunicated. If someone was to use magic and only harm someone, do a love spell, or use magic to find treasure or lost goods, they would be imprisoned for a year on the first offense and then executed if they were to be convicted a second time. This is where people start being executed and when you start seeing the prevalence of witchcraft pamphlets about these cases. So first major case, again, I've already talked about it, involved Atticus Waterhouse, Joan Waterhouse, and Elizabeth Francis, which resulted in the execution of Agnes Waterhouse at the end of July 1566, who is considered quote unquote the first witch of England, even though, like I said, there were cases before this, but they were handled by the church. Legally, she was the first witch of England, I guess. The next month, I'm not sure which date, because the surviving pamphlet is in terrible shape, but sometime in August of 1566, you have this case of John Walsh, and it is just riddled with anti-Catholic propaganda. So just be prepared for that, because it starts immediately in the introduction of this pamphlet with the author saying that John Walsh from Netherbury in Dorsetshire, which is modern day Dorset, in South England, was examined under the charges of sorcery and witchcraft that he learned from a priest named Sir Robert of Drayton. To get deep into semantics that nobody asked for, sorcery and witchcraft are different things historically. I might at some point do an episode kind of just like on the semantics and specific of witchcraft, or maybe I'll just do an episode where I just like read you my historiography paper that I wrote a couple years ago. It is very nuanced, and all the terms have become kind of synonymous, which historically was not the case. So quite a few historians that are really notable in the field of British witch trials boil down witchcraft to a pact that any witch, regardless of gender, makes with the devil. But there are anthropologists who are also studying historical and modern witch trials, because if you aren't aware, there are still people around the world being burned alive for witchcraft. Most people associate these happening in various countries in Africa, like Zambia, the Congo, parts of Nigeria, but it also happens in Papua New Guinea and India and other developing nations. And these anthropologists say that there is a distinction between witchcraft and sorcery. Witchcraft is something that is sort of innate and involuntary. It's like psychic abilities that you're believed to be born with, while sorcery is learned and deliberate. There's also a distinction between like witch and sorcerer and whatnot, and the distinction between all of those that I might elaborate later on a little bit, but that's basically what we are. So apparently Sir Robert of Drayton, which I think is really interesting that he's referred to as Sir and not Father as a priest, which says something immediately about the beliefs of the author of this pamphlet. Not only did he teach John Walsh, but he corrupted all of his followers and seduced them into witchcraft and sorcery. The pamphlet then goes on like 2.5 pages to talk about all the terrible things that Catholics have done. It said it would literally be tedious to tell all the devilish practices and murders and mischiefs of the, quote, fat belly fed monks, flattering friars, idle lusty priests, as well as popes, cardinals, and bishops committed, but we'll tell you a few that are in this pamphlet. Pope Alexander VI, who was pope from 1492 to 1503, who was pretty scandalous for multiple reasons, but one of the largest being that he had a mistress who he had several children with and acknowledged these children had wicked spirits. It even goes on to describe discourses he had with demons, mostly that he said that he would be pope for like 11 and 8, and he assumed that meant 19 years, but actually meant 11 years and 8 months, which is when the devil came quite literally a knocking, and then Pope Alexander VI died after that. Then it mentions Pope Gregory VII, who was pope from 1073 to 1085, who was a sorcerer and a necromancer, who was known as Hildebrand or Hellbrand to his enemies, who was said to have a familiar that helped him with his wealth and also satisfied his quote-unquote fleshly and beastly lusts, which is accusing him of bestiality as well, but also like, if it's a familiar and it's a demon, is that bestiality or is that more like succubus incubus territory? The pamphlet doesn't specify. This is just me asking questions that need to be answered. The pamphlet then mentions Pope John VIII, who was pope from 872 to 882, Pope Sylvester, which I think means Pope Silverius, who was pope from 536 to 537, and Pope Benedict VIII, who was pope from 1012 to 1024, who were also apparently terrible for reasons that he doesn't really go into. The pamphlet then talks about Pope Paul III, who was pope from 1534 to 1549, pretty recently to this pamphlet, who poisoned his mother and nephew for inheritance reasons, according to that. And then it kind of leaves off talking about the worst of the worst, which was Pope Clement VIII, which doesn't make any sense because Pope Clement VIII wasn't Pope until 1590s, and this was written in 1566. So he probably means Pope Clement VII, who was a Medici and just ruled from 1523 to 1534. He was also the Pope that denied Henry VIII from getting his divorce and led to the creation of the Church of England. The pamphlet said that he was a bastard, poisoner, murderer, bawd, which I had to look up for the meaning of like that time period, which I think means someone who runs a brothel, but sometimes it also just means like sex worker or prostitute, which is possibly what this pamphlet means, because separately it also says that he's a whore master. He's also a sodomite, a perjurer, a simoniac, which I also had to look up, which means either like getting your position through bribery or taking bribes to give someone a position in the church. He was also a church robber, a necromancer, and a, quote, practicer of all kinds of wickedness, to just cover all of our bases. So, you know, like everything that God wouldn't like, especially if that God is the one that the Protestants believe in. So back to the man of the hour. After we traveled down Catholic propaganda lane, on an unspecified Tuesday in August of 1566, John Walsh was examined for witchcraft by Thomas Sinclair, John Butler, Robert Buller, William Blackford, and John Boardfield. He said that he had been working with Robert of Drayton for several years, but also that Drayton died 5 years ago, and ever since then he's been a healer in place of Sir Robert Drayton, who taught him everything he knew. When he was asked if he did these things naturally or if he used any secret or private means, he says that he did it naturally, was very vehement to say that he did it naturally and that there was nothing odd about his practices. They then asked him if he had any familiars that he worked with, and he vehemently said no. So it seems like all these accusations are kind of unfounded at this point. So why is this important at all? And why am I talking about it? Well, it's about to get very confusing. So the next thing they asked him was how he knew that people were bewitched, because that's something that he was doing, which we'll talk about a little bit towards the end. And he said it's because the fairies told him. I beg your finest pardon, sir. Like, apparently there were 3 kinds of fairies that he would summon, white ones, green ones, and black ones, of which the black fairies were apparently the worst, that he would go summon at the hills of Dorsetshire at noon and or midnight by taking a book he got from Sir Robert of Drayton that had huge circles in it that he would set 2 candles and a cross made of virgin wax in, along with some frankincense and St. John's wort, and he would raise a familiar, which doesn't make any sense. And they were like, hey, that doesn't make any sense. You just said you didn't have a familiar and now you've changed it. So which is it? Do you have a familiar or are you summoning fairies? And he's like, well, I kind of inherited a familiar from Sir Robert of Drayton, but I never did anything with it or used it, and it left and never came back. But when I did see it, it came to me as a dark gray pigeon or a brindled dog or a man with hooves instead of feet. And then, even though he said he never actually used a familiar, he said that he would summon this familiar for 1 year while Sir Robert of Drayton was alive, and 3 years after he died to find stolen horses or anything else he needed. And in return, he would sacrifice to this familiar a chicken, cat, or dog, and then at one point gave a single drop of blood, which the familiar did not eat. It like put in its paw and like gently carried it away for storage purposes, I suppose. But John Walsh specified that he was of the opinion that if you have the gift of healing and you intentionally do harm, that you will never be able to heal again. He said that he took an oath to heal and that he would never do harm to anybody. He said he only used the familiars to help find stolen or lost goods, but the familiars on their own, through their own accord, would harm people. And John Walsh was aware of witchcraft, and he goes on to describe the use of poppets, which are like not necessarily the same, but similar to what you would think of when you think of like a voodoo doll. He says spirits in the likeness of toads, which is a form familiars will often take, took pictures made of wax, but as it's described, it's more like a doll made of wax, that it will cause the likeness to be ill for 2 years, because that's how long it would take the wax to burn out. if that's what they mean. It says consumed, so I think that means like it would take 2 years for the wax to like fully be burned up, and during that whole time the target would be ill. There are also ones in clay that they would make from the earth of freshly made graves, and a rib bone of the person buried there burned to ashes, a bone from a woman if your target is a woman, a bone from a man if your target is a man. It's then mixed with black spiders and pith from the elder tree. And in the worst cases of magic, the witch will summon the familiar to recite the Pater Noster backwards. And this would harm or kill the person, destroy the crops, or their brew house, or their cattle. Apologies if you hear my dog, not my dog, my neighbor's dog, barking in the background. She literally just like sits outside and lets him chase after cars, and I can't say anything about it because she's like 87 years old and she's really freaking sweet, but I can't stand her dog and all of its barking it does, especially when I'm trying to record a podcast. Anyway, John Walsh affirms again that he has never done any of this magic. He only heals people. And then the pamphlet ends abruptly. And from all that I found in research and all the many books that I have read, John Walsh is not executed. Okay, then, let's talk about it. So based on the laws, it makes sense that John Walsh was not executed, because the law of this time states that you will be executed if you harm someone through witchcraft, and he is vehement that he did not do that. States it multiple times that he did not do that. So at the worst, he was imprisoned for a year for using magic to find lost goods. At the best, he was acquitted. Now, this leads to a greater discussion of cunning folk, which is something that needs a lot more research in the field. Will I be the one who does it? Probably not. Like maybe a little, but probably not. Shrug. Who knows what my life is going to look like in a year? But I will often tell people that to like understand the history of witchcraft, we have to first define like what a witch is, because there are other terms that are often used interchangeably with witch by historians, which maybe shouldn't be used interchangeably. So Keith Thomas, in his 1973 book Religion and the Decline of Magic, defined the witch as a person of either sex, but more often female, who could mysteriously injure people or commit maleficium or magic done to do harm. To elaborate a little, the harm could be physical injury or death to people and farm animals, preventing cows from giving milk, and disrupting the domestic processes like making butter, cheese, or beer. Christina Larner, who's another historian who takes a little bit more of a feminist view in her definition, says that the witch and the stereotype of the witch is an independent adult woman who does not conform to the male ideal of proper female behavior. So meaning that she might be assertive, she might not be very nurturing, she might not want children or to be married, and she speaks up for herself and maybe is abrasive in doing so when she's expected to be meek or obey the men of society. However, this is not how people would have defined the witch in the late medieval and early modern period. So during the time of the witch hunts, which was like 1400 to 1600s, there were some trials in the 1700s, but it's far less common during that time period, especially in England. The witch was really defined by their relationship with the devil. Like being a woman who was outspoken or being an outcast, or any way that I've briefly defined it just now, was more of like a red flag, if you will, for a sign that you sold your soul to the devil. Because what woman, let's be fair, although there were men accused, obviously, we're talking about one in this episode, the amount of men that were put on trial and executed for witchcraft were far less than women. What woman would go against the social norm and be outspoken and corrupt the nurturing nature of a mother that didn't sell their soul to the devil? And this kind of leads to the next point. So the Witchcraft Act put in place in 1563 that we discussed, that we're basing these court cases on, had the maleficium, right? The magic done to do harm. But it also had doing a love spell or finding lost goods, which are things that would often be done by cunning folk. So at the higher level of society, demonologists and members of the clergy were having this idea that cunning folk and witches were pretty synonymous, which is probably what led to that inclusion in the law. But that's not really what the common people thought. And the common people in England were the ones who were making the accusations. So to quote directly from my historiography paper that I wrote in 2021, cunning folk were wise men or wise women who are said to give advice, help find stolen goods, act as matchmakers, administer folk medicine, advise how to deal with tormentors, cast spells that were often like verbal, bastardized versions of Catholic prayers, which were sometimes written or worn as amulets, and would sometimes teach how to sacrifice young calves by burning them alive. They would sometimes use devices like crystal balls to divine some answers and would reference astrology or at least use astrological terms. Other times they would claim to commune with the fairies, and with all this in mind, they were considered positive contributions to society and beneficial to the societal psyche. Due to this, they were not often reported or accused of being witches. In fact, they were often implemented to help discover witches. A cunning person or a village healer could administer medicines or try to tell the weather based on natural phenomena, but the suspicion of sorcery occurred when one claimed that they had powers beyond natural causes. So essentially, cunning folk practiced what we would kind of refer to today as white magic, while witches practiced black magic. And in doing so, the cunning folk were very beneficial to a very superstitious society. A lot of people were of the belief that the best way to fight the devil was to lower yourself to his level and meet him where he was, right? So if he was going to resort to magic to do harm to you, you are going to resort to magic that would defend you, because what are you supposed to do against the devil's magic? So this is where you see apotropaic counter magic symbols. This is where cunning folk would come in, giving amulets or reading cards or other symbolism. This is where those demonologists and members of the clergy really come into play as well in the writing of the laws. Because to them, cunning folk were even worse than witches, because witches were sort of like unabashedly diabolical, while cunning folk, they believed, still received their powers from the devil and drew the population away from God by telling people that they were doing good when they actually were not. The cunning folk were telling people that the best way to fight the devil is to fight fire with fire. So here are these spells and here are these things that you can do to defend yourself magically on like a supernatural level, when actually these demonologists and clergymen were saying it was the devil just being really smart and tricking you. But again, to the common people, they were important members of society. And it really wasn't until the 1700s when people started turning against cunning folk, but not as witches and as diabolical, but more as con men, right? Alan McFarlane, who is a historian and anthropologist, said that in one study he did in Essex County in the 16th or 17th century, I can't quite remember, which is where like most of the trials happen in Essex County, England, there were thought to be, I think it was like less than 10 miles between cunning folk, and were probably even more numerous than that. The interesting thing is that when most people were accused of witchcraft, it was women. Like most of the people accused of witchcraft were women. We know this, that's kind of obvious to state yet again, but most people who were said to be cunning folk were men. McFarlane said that at one point he found a record of 63 cunning folk and 44 of them were men, and quite often women who were accused of witchcraft were also cunning women. The case that comes to mind immediately for me that we'll talk about at some point, because there's a lot of like discourse about it, so you can find it in the interim if you want to. But it's the Pendle witches from 1611. It's pretty much like an entire cunning family, really, that's put on trial. This whole like dynamic between like cunning men and women witches, it is the part that needs more research, but it could be like wealth and gender disparities, that like men, for example, were more likely to be educated and able to read and have the money to purchase books or supplies that made them seem more reliable, whereas cunning women were more likely to learn through oral tradition and work more naturally. So kind of like in the same way that we have like witchcraft and sorcery that I mentioned before, cunning men would be sorcerers while women would be witches, if that makes any sense. That's the best kind of description I can kind of come up with. But the relationship between witches and cunning folk, definitely something in the field that needs to be explored more by somebody else. So with all this in mind, John Walsh was a cunning man. Considered for the most part a beneficial contribution to society. He is Catholic, so that's where the Catholic prayers come into play. He is healing people, probably through folk medicine. He summons fairies, sacrifices animals to said fairies, although it's conflated to say that they're familiar. And he is adamant in saying that he doesn't have any powers beyond natural means. And by one of the questions he answers in the pamphlet, he helps find people who are witches through these means that he uses. Now, there are a couple kind of like interesting things about this case that I want to elaborate on a little bit more. First and foremost, like I said, it solely features a man on trial for witchcraft, which is not something that you will see often in English cases. Often men who are accused have some sort of like ties to a woman who's accused, but this is really interesting in that by itself. But it always comes back to this to come into my niche topic, which is the witch's familiar. Some historians use this case as a way to say that the origin of the witch's familiar is in fairy lore, largely because he says that he summons fairies, but then kind of like shifts to say, oh, no, I'm actually summoning familiars. So let's kind of like talk about that argument, because it's not one that I agree with, but I want to sort of like explain the thought process behind it before I verbally eviscerate it. So there are a lot of theories into the origin of the familiar. Alan McFarlane, again, kind of speculates that it comes from the English obsession with pets. Another historian, James Serple, says that it's sort of like a hybrid between a pet, a child, and like a paganistic, shamanistic guardian spirit. But most historians tend to kind of fall into two camps, right? That the familiar is an evolution of fairy lore, kind of taking the beliefs of the people and elevating it into the religious sphere. But then there are others that talk about that the familiar is like a folklorized version of the devil, kind of taking the religious beliefs and bringing it down to the people. So kind of like two sides of the same coin. It just depends on how you're looking at it. So the main historian that seems to sort of believe that it's from fairy lore is Emma Wilby. So to quote directly from my extensive paper that I wrote on the subject in 2023, she says that the familiars were said to help witches with domestic affairs like human animal health, domestic farming processes, and general securing of material property, as well as the ability to divine the future, seek out lost goods, and identify criminals, which were often associated with fairies, namely hobgoblins. She says a lot about the John Walsh trial, which I've already done, so I won't be rehashing that. But basically, kind of by contradicting himself and saying it's a fairy, no, it's familiar, JK, it's actually a familiar, it supports a theory that these creatures may have been conflated. But here's the thing, okay? So first and foremost, we have to remember that these pamphlets were never written by the person on trial. They were written by people with a goal in mind. Often that goal was propaganda, but also enforcing and corroborating the beliefs of the time, okay? Also, it seems that this conflation is a one-time thing. I think that there's one other pamphlet that I've read about that I haven't personally read, where they talk about fairies, but it's like into the 1600s, right? This is not like a common thing that happens. Pamphlets on witchcraft, treatises on witchcraft and demonologies, laws even state that the familiar is its own thing. To again directly quote from my paper, based on other readings and analyses, fairies and familiars were separate entities that coexisted. Additionally, Wilby supports her argument by using examples of Scottish folklore, with some dating to the 19th century. Not only were Scotland's witch trials inherently different to England, aligning more with the rest of Europe, with the sabbat, night flying, and utilization of torture, many historians, like Cameron Ewan, state that folklore and imaginative literature, while useful, can also be unreliable, because it's hard to date and discern what were creative liberties in the process. Additionally, research into the beliefs throughout the rest of Europe showed that there were multiple countries who believed that there were useful household demons, like the Victolin in Germany and the Lairs Familiars in the Netherlands. Homes that had these house demons, sometimes called ladies of the house, were considered extremely fortunate. Which leads to the other camp that I'm a part of that believes in the idea that the devil becoming folklorized led to familiars, along with some other beliefs that I've already talked about in another episode. In October of last year, I did a special preview of a presentation that I was giving on the subject, and you can listen to me rant all about it. I'm giving another presentation on the topic later on this year, date TBD, that will be much longer. So I'll probably do another special release where I give my presentation. But this episode has already gone on like way far too long, and I have to leave. So this is just where I'm going to leave it today on the strange and interesting and very short case of John Walsh, and how even a 4-page pamphlet can be an important historical document for many reasons. So thank you so much for listening today. If you like what you heard and want to hear more, please consider subscribing or leaving a review or joining my Patreon. And remember, friends, history may be watching you, so don't fuck it up. And always practice safe hex when summoning fairies. Familiars. Fairies. Familiars? Familiar. Familiar fairies. Fairies who are familiar with familiars who are actually fairies. Nailed it. Okay. Bye.